I often think that interesting is, well, more interesting than strictly good, if you know what I mean. So in this video, I'm going to point out over 75 interesting, weird retro games that I think are worth booting up. Now, they might have a few hiccups here and there, but I think they're neat for one reason or another. But keep in mind that the barrier to entry to playing most of these games now has just been completely eliminated. You can play these kinds of games on your phone, your PC, or even those weird little retro handheld thingies. The goal of this video is to point you towards the neat, the interesting, and the obscure. And I've got a real mix of games here. So if one doesn't grab you, just stick around because the next one might be perfect for you. And this being a mega video, I'm going to talk about a bunch of new stuff here that I'm covering here for the very first time, and then I'm going to get onto the stuff that I've covered in the past for new viewers. Anyway, that's enough preamble, let's get on with it. I'm a sucker for games with the now quaint 90s attitude. And Dinosaurs For Hire is exactly that. It's the definition of a solid B game, and honestly I found its dated, rebellious spirit pretty charming. It's not really doing too much new, it's just a simple, straightforward good time. Imagine Contra, but tone down the difficulty and slow down the pacing. It's a run and gun shooter, but you just happen to be playing as one of 3 alien dinosaur mercenaries. It swaps Contra's relatively serious sci-fi for an offbeat vibe pulled straight out of an 80s comic book, which is exactly what this is based on. The gameplay is exactly what you'd expect. You run, you jump, and you shoot at everything. And it isn't shy about giving away power-ups right away, including what is essentially the equivalent to the spread gun. It makes you feel kitted out and powerful through most of this short playthrough. It also throws in set-piece moments that have massive screen-filling sprites that are fantastic to look at. But its greatest strength is its concentrated 90s vibe. But the mechanics here aren't perfect. You have a melee for close quarter situations, but it's pretty clunky. The range is just too short, and I found it to be easier to just kind of forget it ever existed and rely on your main guns. The different characters are also just simple sprite swaps, which is also a missed opportunity. But if you love the 16-bit aesthetic, Dinosaurs For Hire is here for you. It's not the most varied shooter, but it's a fun time that won't take too long to blast through. I'm not the biggest shmup fan, so when I heard about Gunbarich, a spin-off of the Gunbarich shmup series, I almost skipped it, but I'm so glad that I didn't. It isn't a side-scrolling shooter, it's one of the best block breakers I've ever played. Imagine mixing the fundamental screen clearing of Arkanoid with the twitchy ball handling of a pinball game. That's Gunbarich in a nutshell. It's a great mix of ideas that seem obvious in hindsight. While the goal is still to launch the ball and destroy all the blocks, the pinball mechanics really changed things up quite a bit. Instead of the typical breakout style paddle, you control a set of pinball flippers. And that immediately shifts the dynamic from passively surviving to aggressive and more considered play. The presentation is a colorful, kid-friendly aesthetic, but don't let that fool you. Its lighthearted look hides its classic arcade-style difficulty, which I suppose is pretty typical from a game from Psycho. So if you're into score chasing and don't mind a serious challenge, you should check out Gunbarich. It's even been ported to most modern consoles in Steam, so it's pretty easy to find. I love transformation mechanics, so I was easily won over with Sylvan Tale on the Game Gear. It takes the familiar top-down Zelda-style formula and builds its progression system around its transformations. While you still find some traditional items, the loop is focused on discovering new forms, like a mole to destroy obstacles, a turtle to tank fire traps, or a mermaid to swim around. Your transformations function as your abilities that open up the world in a way that gives it a Metroidvania-style structure. But beyond that central gimmick, it's a fully fledged classic-style adventure with dungeons, bosses, mazes, and even some oddly familiar enemies like spiders and those jelly-style blobs. It even has a hint system that uses skeletons holding notes, which is weirdly similar to like Dark Souls messages that build up the world's history and give you hints about what to do next. For a Game Gear game, Sylvan Tale also just looks gorgeous. So if you want to check out an unsung classic that blends Zelda-like adventure with transformations from like Ben 10, you should track down the fan translation of Sylvan Tale. Psychic Killer Taromaru is a holy grail for Sega Saturn collectors. It was a very limited Japan-only release, and a physical copy today would cost you a staggering price tag around $1,500. But obviously, I wouldn't recommend anyone spend that kind of dosh on a single game. At its heart, it's a 2.5D run-and-gun game similar to stuff like Sunset Riders or Mystic Warriors, but the major difference is that it has a more stiff control scheme. It's entirely built around auto-targeting, and to attack, you need to stand your ground and shoot, which makes things feel pretty clunky. But where this game truly shines is in its aesthetic. It's a fun showcase of that special Saturn magic. It blends gorgeous 2D sprites on top of 3D backgrounds that really creates a striking look. It's super distinct, and its appeal is much more of a fun vibe and a historical oddity than a great game to play. So I'd say that it's absolutely not worth the $1,500, but if you're curious about it, I'd strongly recommend you find alternate ways to play it. Volfied is a 1989 arcade reimagining of Kix, and it's better in every single way. While the original Kix was endlessly cloned, this sequel has languished in relative obscurity. But shout out to Ben Hansen from MinMax for putting this one on my radar. It takes the tense screen clearing mechanics of the original, but gives it a fresh sci-fi coat of paint and an enemy variety that you might expect out of a shmup. Your goal is to capture at least 80% of the screen by cutting off territory, and you're relatively safe along the edges, but vulnerable the moment that you venture out drawing the new line. But instead of dodging abstract shapes, you're facing off against detailed pixel art enemies, and there are even power-ups like lasers and speed boosts. And if an enemy comes in contact with your line, you don't die instantly here. Instead, a spark races down the line towards you, giving you a chance to outrun it to safety. It gives it a tension that pushes you to make riskier and more satisfying cuts as you trap enemies and uncover power-ups. The satisfaction of carving out a huge section of the screen and watching enemies get annihilated is a feeling that's just still unmatched. So if you love high score chasing games built on risk versus reward, you owe it to yourself to track down Volfied. Released in 1992, Panic Restaurant is a rare NES game that now costs collectors around $900, so I'd recommend finding an alternate way to play it. It's a Mario 3 style platformer that stars a chef who fights sentient food. You start off armed with a frying pan, but like in a Super Mario Bros. Game, you can get power-ups like throwable plates that can really help out a ton. But also, like a Mario game, you're downgraded back to your initial pan after a single hit. As a late-era NES game, it pushes the hardware for great expressive sprites and fun music, but also it's a trade-off that can cause a significant amount of flicker and slowdown when there's too much happening on screen. It's a solid, polished, albeit standard NES platformer that's definitely worth checking out, especially if you can find other ways to play it. Alright, let me be clear. The Mansion of Hidden Souls on the Sega Saturn is not a good game. Frankly, it's a wreck. But I also think it's just insane enough to justify a 1-hour playthrough with a walkthrough. It's actually a sequel to a Sega CD game called Mansion of Hidden Souls. Minus the. Think of it like the difference between The Fast and the Furious and Fast and Furious. The game itself, though, is a Myst-style visual novel. Sort of. It's a mystery that takes place within this mansion, where all the residents have become immortal by transforming themselves into butterflies. You play as June, one of these butterfly people who's investigating why the moon has been turned red and who's threatening the mansion. But keep in mind, you're not playing much of a game here. The movement is entirely on rails. You slowly navigate from node to node, watching pre-rendered transitions play out. Progress comes from talking to the other residents who are all butterfly people, but represented as these floating heads that look unbelievably goofy.
June, how long is it since you last came here? Well, since turning my back on human society and changing my form to that of a butterfly.
And all of it just leads to one of the wildest endings that I've ever seen. After an hour or so of slowly navigating a relatively dull plot, the game suddenly transforms into some tokusatsu nonsense that comes completely out of nowhere.
I am Candola. I am the other part who's been separated from you. Whilst you were stupidly posing as master of the mansion, I had to put up with being treated as a freak with half a body.
So if you want to play an obscure Sega Saturn game that goes completely off the rails, you have to see this. Then again, maybe just watching the ending on YouTube might be enough for most people. Super Metal Crusher on the PC Engine is a robot game from 1999, but it has a twist that you don't actually control your bot. It's an extremely passive game. The best way to describe it is to imagine BattleBots, and your job isn't to fight, but to manage. You spend your time tuning your robot's stats before the match, and once a fight begins, it's a completely hands-off AI versus AI battle. Tweaking the stats of your robot influences its behavior, for example, like making it less aimless or more aggressive. But once you set it up, you just have to let it go. And it can be really fun in a super specific type of way. It's kind of like the thrill you get out of watching the DVD logo bounce around the screen, hoping for it to finally hit the corner, but that same passive design is also its biggest flaw. It can be incredibly frustrating to watch a robot wander around aimlessly, doing absolutely nothing you intended. Because the bots can be so unfocused, the fights themselves can often become annoying and just ramble on. It honestly works best if you're giving this game about half your attention. And yes, I know there's a cheat code that lets you take control of the robot, but I think that just completely defeats the entire purpose of the game. Super Metal Crusher is an interesting little curiosity, but it's definitely for a very specific type of person. People who enjoy the management part, and are happy to just let the bot loose and see what happens. First up is Elan Doree, a Japan-only Sega Saturn fighting game from 1999. But the catcher with this one is that it puts you onto the back of a dragon for aerial combat. Think Panzer Dragoon, but in the form of an early 3D fighting game like Tekken. I wouldn't put this up in the pantheon of great fighting games, but it does do some really unique stuff that makes it interesting. The gameplay is all about fighting while mounted, and while it doesn't have the best fighting system ever, it does have enough to be a, that's neat kinda oddity. One cool thing is when you end up knocking an opponent off their dragon, you leave them stunned for a bit on the ground, and that opens them up for some extra damage, and it becomes a frantic scramble to kind of take advantage of the opportunity. Visually, it's a technical marvel for the Sega Saturn, because it achieves some really clean 3D graphics with textures and transparencies that really push the hardware. The Sega Saturn famously struggled with transparencies, often resorting to a dithering effect, but in Elan Doree it manages some surprisingly clean effects. Also, a cool thing that this game does is, once you realize that each character is basically two distinct characters, the rider and the dragon, it becomes really impressive. It has its quirks, like the combat feeling pretty jank and the movement feeling a bit floaty, as you could probably imagine, but those rough edges really are part of its charm. This is from when 3D fighters were still finding their legs, especially on home consoles. So don't expect something amazing with this one, but it does take some pretty cool swings, and it is an interesting piece of fighting game history. So if you're looking for a strange take on a now well-trodden genre, or just somebody who appreciates when a developer takes an odd swing, Elan Doree is worth looking into. And then we have Night Slashers, a beat-em-up that often does get brought up in underrated arcade conversations, but I'm surprised it took me so long to give it a shot. The basic gist is that it takes the belt-scroller action of Streets of Rage or Final Fight, but gives it a campy horror coat of paint. So picture a Monster Mash sort of approach, with zombies, werewolves, vampires, and mad scientists that you bash your way through. As a huge fan of both horror and brawlers, it's the perfect example of a great game that I, someone whose wheelhouse is exactly this kind of stuff, hasn't played yet. It really goes to show you that there's so many excellent games out there that would be perfect for one person's specific taste, but they just get brushed over. That said, if you're familiar with this genre, it's not groundbreaking beyond its theming, because it's still just a straight up beat 'em up. You're side-scrolling, punching, kicking, and beating the hell out of everything in your path as you would expect. but it's that fun, universal monster style theme that makes it something special. But here you get 3 different characters, each with their own sets of moves and goofy horror gimmicks. There's Jake Hunter, a monster-slaying cyborg who channels the chaos of Ash Williams, Christopher Smith, a vampire hunter reminiscent of the iconic Van Helsing, and Hong Hu Zhao, the mystical martial artist who embodies this unique kung fu horror blend from stuff like The Legend of the Seven Golden Vampires. Data East was also pushing some boundaries here technically with big, grotesquely animated sprites, and not shying away from swarming the player with hordes of enemies to take on. That's all to say that Night Slashers has a great horror atmosphere that still feels fresh. It's a grindhouse take that revels in the schlock in the best way possible. It's not the most fleshed out or deep, but, for a quarter muncher, it can be a blast to get through in about 40 minutes or so. Alright, but now I need to address the elephant in the room. The remake. Do yourself a favor and avoid it like the plague. Like I said, much of the appeal of it is its superficial elements, and in the remake, a lot of that got a pretty massive downgrade. It replaces the gorgeous, gritty sprite art with flat, ugly, and almost Flash-like style visuals. It just completely robs it of its original aesthetic and charm. So if you're looking for a solid arcade beat-em-up with a distinct B-horror movie aesthetic, make sure you check out the original version of Night Slashers. It's a cult classic for a reason. Wai Wai World 2 is an often forgotten Famicom exclusive from 1991 that mashes together Konami's franchises of the era in a really fun way. The core of it is a platformer that feels actually pretty good on its own, but the added fun of seeing all these stylized takes of your favorites from Konami, it really pushes it to another level. Obviously, this is a sequel to yet another Japan-only release, but comparatively, Wai Wai World 2 blows it out of the water with more refined gameplay and level design. The whole premise here is that you play as Rickle, a character created for this franchise that can transform into different Konami characters to save a princess from the evil Waramon. But that's not why you're here. It's pure fan service to Konami's 8-bit era with characters from Contra, Castlevania, Getsu Fumaden, Goemon, and even Twinbee and Gradius. The best part is that some levels even completely switch genres, with Gradius and Twinbee stages that go full-on horizontal shoot-em-ups. But don't forget the main man Rickle himself. He controls solid with a double jump and a blaster gun. But yeah, at the end of the day here, you're probably like me and you're just looking forward for your next chance to transform. It does a great job of being an approachable late-era 8-bit Nintendo platformer, think like Tiny Toons or Little Samson, while never quite reaching the heights of their quality, but artistically it goes for the big chunky sprites and a generalized style of cuteness that's added to all the characters, and they end up meshing all together because of it. But in the end, if you're a retro Konami sicko like myself, there's a lot to love here. So if you're looking for a breezy little NES side-scrolling platformer, make sure you don't skip this one. I've heard word of the Neo Geo Pocket Color cult classic Biomotor Unitron, but when I finally ended up booting it up, I expected a simple monster training clone, but it immediately impressed me with so much more than what I was expecting. Its hooks sink in pretty fast, and that's because of its really fun customization options. You play as a trainer of a Unitron robot, and your goal is to take it on runs through dungeons to collect money and materials, then go to town, upgrade, swap out parts, and steadily become more powerful in order to climb the ranks of Unitron trainers. The gameplay loop is incredibly satisfying. The dungeons themselves are mazes with turn-based combat, and each run feels very different. The customizability here is incredibly cool, because with each part that you put on your robot, it's like swapping out basic arms for rocket launchers, stuff like that, but it visibly changes its appearance, and I'm a sucker for that. And since you're only working with one Unitron, you end up growing naturally attached to it. It's kind of like the bond that car guys get with their car. You're not collecting a ton of different monsters, you're meticulously tweaking and tuning your one machine. And because you're crafting a unique machine from what starts out as a basic kit model, every aesthetic and strategic choice truly feels like it's yours. Sure, the game often does become grindy dungeon crawling, but honestly the reward for that grinding being new parts and looks really just make it worth it. Visually, it has amazing character portraits that make every NPC feel like their own person after a few conversations, and the Unitrons themselves can vary from really sleek designs to odd amalgamations and messes, but that's largely due to the wide variety of customization options. And yes, while this might sound pretty similar to Metabots, Biomotor Unitron has a much more focused structure that sets it apart, and it's that structure that makes it a great pick up and play game for short sessions on a handheld. So if you want an excellent game for your retro handheld, Steam Deck, or even Switch, you should check this one out. Next up is Mizubaku Daiboken Liquid Kids, or really just known to most people as Liquid Kids. It's a Taito arcade game, but what I'm talking about here is the port to the PC Engine. The basics of it is that it takes on the classic platformer style, but adds a clever new water-based set of mechanics to it. You play as Hippopo, a little platypus who's armed with these water bombs. And the cool thing is that how they function as your tool for every level. You use them to soak enemies, leaving them stunned so you can kick them off the screen, but you can also use that same water to grow plants into new platforms. This dual-purpose mechanic really feels great and encourages you to just kind of go wild with the water. It's bursting with color and charm and really great sprites and fluid animations, so it really feels unique. It also has that distinct Taito feel, reminiscent of a lot of their other whimsical arcade games like Bubble Bobble. This version though does have its quirks being an early 90s arcade port. In translation, it does lose some background parallax scrolling effects and some boss sprites are smaller than the arcade version, but as somebody who played this as the first version that I've played, I never really felt like I was missing anything. The core gameplay loop here is just super solid and joyful, and really the minor technical downgrades barely register. So if you want another solid little platformer and appreciate clever little mechanics, Liquid Kids is worth looking into. Then I have Pop and Smash, a Super Famicom exclusive that's really similar to one of my other Super Famicom favorites, that being Sanrio World Smash Ball. It takes the simple competitive action of a game like Pong or Windjammers, but gives it a chaotic party game coat of paint. The goal here is to simply try to hit the ball past your opponent into their goal. But the catch with this one is that you have free top-down movement across the entire field. And that makes it all about zoning, and it lets you dive for last-second saves and play strategically. You position yourself to set up tricky bank shots or rush the net for pressuring your opponents. It's simple to get into, but it's the kind of thing that has a surprising amount of depth once you play against a friend. It goes for this colorful look with goofy characters, but that's because it's based on a license of the Bow Wow manga. But you don't need to have any familiarity with that. Its lighthearted vibes and widely appealing gameplay make it feel really approachable. It's not the most amazing deep game out there, but it has enough to just be another, that's kinda neat oddity. So give this a look if you're looking for a fast-paced local multiplayer game for the next time you get together with some friends.
Boom!
This game comes up often as the best game for the Virtual Boy, but that said, the reach of people at this point that even know of Nintendo's short-lived Virtual Boy is shrinking every day. Jack Bros is a weird spin-off of the Megami Tensei series, with it actually being the first game related to the franchise to ever be released in the West. But if you're expecting an RPG, you might want to look elsewhere. This is a top-down action game where you run through mazes against a time limit. You choose between Jack Frost, Jack Lantern, and Jack Skeleton to play as, and your goal is to find all of the keys and escape to the next floor before the time runs out. Each character has a slightly different way of attacking, which adds some variety if you want to replay through this one too. One neat little detail is how this game handles health. There's not a health bar in sight, so instead when you take damage it shaves seconds off of your timer, but when you kill an enemy it adds time back to your timer. So it adds a layer of split-second decision making where sometimes it might be best to just avoid an enemy altogether instead of risking taking damage. It creates a constant tension that keeps you on your toes. Since it was a Virtual Boy game, it was intended to be viewed through hues of red, but if you're booting this up now, not on original hardware, it's pretty easy to find a palette that's not so offensive to the eyes. And when you do end up shedding the red, the sprite work really shines, and it is really charming. One minor thing that's lost by viewing this not in 3D though is some little touches, like the floor below the one that you're on being visible below you, and it's stuff like that that you're really losing out on, but I guess you could technically see that if you're playing this on like a 3DS or maybe in VR, but I don't think it's really worth going out of your way to view it this way. But you can tell that this is a little passion project, and it being relegated to a doomed console, the odds for its notability were pretty stacked against it. But if you're into retro curiosities or a Megami Tensei sicko, Jack Bros is a fun and surprisingly intense little game that's another one that's a cult classic for a reason. The Adventures of Lomax is a PlayStation 1 game that's a spin-off of Lemmings, but reimagined as an action platformer. So think something along the lines of like Rayman, where you're jumping and spinning your way through levels with this really highly detailed sprite art. The cool thing though that this gains by being related to Lemmings is how it incorporates some of that game's abilities. Lomax can use special helmets to gain powers and do classic Lemming-style jobs like building floating platforms to cross gaps, digging through soft ground, or using floating umbrellas to drift safely downwards. These abilities are smartly woven into the level design, creating some light puzzle platforming section. The aesthetic of a PlayStation 1 sprite art side-scroller was rare, but always a treat. Since it came out in 1996 when everybody was already obsessed with polygons, these kind of games were actively fought against being released on the PS1 by Sony themselves, but a few luckily ended up sneaking through. And this is straight from the peak of 2D sprite work. The environments are detailed and colorful, even using parallax scrolling and movement into the foreground and background to show off what the hardware could do with 2D animation. But unfortunately, since it was a 2D game at the time, it didn't get much publicity and was mostly brushed over. It does feel a bit slippery and the hit detection is unforgiving, but it's a great example of a developer taking an odd swing. So if you're looking for a beautiful 32-bit 2D platformer, or you're just looking for a weird spin-off of a beloved series, The Adventures of Lomax should find its way onto your SD card. Next up is the Game Boy Advance adaptation of the 2007 CG TMNT movie. The catch with this one is that, while the console versions were forgettable 3D licensed games, the GBA game is a 2D beat-em-up that's surprisingly solid. It was developed by Ubisoft Montreal, and you could tell that they really knew what they were trying to go for with this one. That being the feeling of the classic TMNT brawlers, but, well, it doesn't quite meet their quality, it's still a pretty fun time. The combat feels snappy, and each turtle has their unique moves and special attributes, which encourages switching between them. It even borrows some mechanics from other games in the genre, like River City Ransom, like collecting money from falling enemies to buy upgrades. Interestingly, I think this game actually aged way better than the 3D versions on like the GameCube and Xbox and PS2, because this game's 2D art really does scale up pretty well. All that said, it's a pretty short game, and some of the levels are a bit repetitive, but it's a beat 'em up after all, and that's just simply part of what you expect from the genre. For a movie tie-in game that's just been kind of brushed under the rug at this point, it really is a pretty good game that harkens back to the Turtles' heyday. So make sure you give this one a look if you're into the TMNT and beat 'em ups, or you just like games that punch way above their weight. Lexis is a puzzle game for the Atari Lynx that I found to be shockingly addictive. It mashes together the frantic block dropping of Tetris and the word building of Scrabble. And yeah, that may sound a lot like Wordtris, but this actually sticks a lot closer to truly the style of Tetris. It takes a simple word puzzle game, but stacks on a constant pressure with the screen filling up with these falling letter tiles. Once you form a valid word, those tiles end up vanishing and you rack up points based on its length. But since you probably will end up having a mess of tiles on top of the words you're clearing, it can cause cascading combos of words. And the real magic happens when you clear a word and the letters above it fall into place, forming new words entirely on their own. And these chains end up feeling amazing. It's got all the stuff you'd expect as you progress, the levels get harder and the tiles fall faster, which really do crank up the challenge a lot. And it can quickly devolve into trying to stagger consonants and vowels in an attempt to lock into different words. But even when you are mindlessly doing that, it's still surprisingly engaging. But ultimately, Lexis is one of those games that successfully blends two genres to create something that feels incredibly addictive. So if you're a fan of word games or you just want to play something neat on the often hated Atari Lynx, Lexis is worth a few rounds. And then we have Wolfchild, an action platformer that showed up on a bunch of systems in the early 90s, though the one I'm most familiar with and the one I'm talking about here is the Sega Genesis port. Takes the run and gun action of something like Contra, but gives it a sci-fi werewolf theme. While it might not be the best Wolfman shooter on the console, that honor goes to Contra Hardcore, it finds its own little niche. The main hook here is the transformation. You start each level as a regular guy who's stuck with a pretty short range punch, but as you bust open paws and collect energy orbs, you fill a meter that eventually ends up letting you unleash the beast. You go from being this underpowered human, playing defensively, to becoming the titular Wolfchild, a powerhouse who can blast energy projectiles from his fists. Suddenly, you're on the offensive, tearing through enemies that gave you trouble just moments before. Visually, it has that gritty, detailed sprite art that just screams, 90s Sega Genesis. You get it, you know what I mean. Lots of dark palettes and industrial-looking backgrounds. All that said, the controls feel pretty stiff, and the level design here is not blowing anybody away. But, those can be part of its V-game charm. Also, the vanilla Genesis version here isn't really the best one out there. The Sega CD version is the version that you should really boot up and play if you're coming to this for the first time. It has a full Red Book audio soundtrack and extra stages that really make it the definitive version. So look into Wolfchild if you're looking for a 90s B-tier 16-bit vibe. Alright, and then we have True Lies on the Super Nintendo. The LJN logo strikes fear into the hearts of so many retro game appreciators, so I was pretty surprised when this 1995 movie tie-in turned out to be pretty legit. It's a top-down run-and-gun game where you blast your way through levels and loosely follow the plot of the movie. So think in the vein of like an arcade shooter like Smash TV, but with objective-based levels. But the one thing that really made me click with this one is its dive roll. That said, you also do get the solid arsenal of guns, from pistols to shotguns and even Uzis, but diving through gunfire with the dive and dodge is just really fun. It adds a whole nother layer of agility to an otherwise pretty standard shooter. The other funny thing that I ended up really liking about this game was the ambivalent citizens that were just kind of roaming around as you were in these firefights with no real care or attention to what the hell is going on around them. It's pretty funny, but they're really there just to force you to be a little bit more careful amidst the chaos, and killing too many of them will end your mission. All that said, the stages here can be a little bit too big for their own good, and essentially if you boil them down, they're really just a bunch of mazes that can be pretty brutally difficult to navigate. But nowadays, in the age of save states and rewind, I don't think that the difficulty is going to really bother you if you don't mind indulging in some of those less kosher retro gaming habits. So give this one a look if you're a fan of the James Cameron movie and don't mind a few quirks with the gameplay, because in the end, True Lies is far better than it really has any right to be. First up is a survival horror game on the Sega Saturn called Deep Fear. It was released in 1998, right as the Saturn was winding down in the West, which led to it never releasing in North America. But to cut to the chase, this was obviously a response to Resident Evil, but that's not really all it was. Deep Fear is set in a claustrophobic underwater research station called the Big Table, and the story starts with a mysterious space capsule that has been long thought lost, but it crashes nearby in the Pacific. And as you probably could guess, it brings an infection with it that turns the crew into horrible mutants. You play as an ex-Navy SEAL who has to figure out what's going on and how to survive this mysterious plague. The underwater setting immediately sets it apart from Resident Evil's zombie outbreaks and creepy houses. Where Resident Evil was inspired by Romero's Dead series and Sweet Home, Deep Fear took an inspiration from films like The Abyss and The Thing. And that means that it leans more into the suffocating isolation that would be evoked from a location like this. That said though, it's not all serious. The voice acting here is totally absurd and bad in the best way possible.
Whoa, your boyfriend? Just kidding.
But for the actual gameplay itself, it sticks to the survival horror blueprint with exploration, item hunting, and puzzle solving. But there are a few changes that make this more distinct, like the ability to move and shoot at the same time, and since the Saturn had an optional analog controller, it had support for it with analog movement. Overall, the game is much more action-focused as well, giving you a dedicated grenade button and a lot more ammo than the typical survival horror game, so you can get away with spraying and praying a lot more here. But the biggest thing here that sets this game apart is its oxygen management system. Each area has a limited air supply that depletes over time, and it depletes even more when you're firing your weapon. So you'll need to find air terminals to refill, and that adds a constant sense of pressure. Deep Fear is a game that probably didn't impress at its time, but now its look has its own charm to it, with polygonal characters superimposed on pre-rendered backgrounds. The soundtrack is also composed by Kenji Kawai, who's really known for his iconic work on Ghost in the Shell.
What is this?
The creature cell is transforming into the mouse cell at an unbelievable speed.
Transforming?
Right.
If you're a fan of retro survival horror and you're looking for something a bit different, this is worth at least booting up. Just be prepared for quite a few rough edges. Next is Panzer Bandit, a PS1 side-scrolling beat-em-up that was only released in Japan. Visually, it has a great anime look to it because the character designs were done by Yoshitsune Izuna, an artist with a history of creating a ton of different designs for a bunch of different anime. But Panzer Bandit is more than just pretty. The gameplay itself is solid. It's got your standard strong and weak attacks, but the two-plane system where you can jump between the foreground and the background adds a layer to things. No pun intended. And on top of that, there's a whole combo system where you can get into some pretty satisfying juggles. Plus, each of the main characters, even the unlockable bosses, have special unique moves and super attacks. It almost feels like a simplified fighting game at times. If you're a fan of games like Guardian Heroes, you'll feel right at home here. Panzer Bandit obviously lifts a ton of inspiration from it, but paring things down to a simpler 2-lane system compared to Guardian Heroes' 3 lanes might even make it a more straightforward, easier to get into game. It's a shame that this was never officially released outside of Japan, but there are many ways to boot up a PS1 game now, so you really shouldn't miss out. You can even play co-op in the story mode or fight with up to 4 people in a versus mode. So if you're itching for a lesser-known lane-based beat-em-up, check out Panzer Bandit. Next up is a often forgotten Klonoa game for the WonderSwan, Kaze no Klonoa Moonlight Museum. Released exclusively in Japan in 1999, it yet again has you play as Namco's attempted mascot Klonoa as he makes his way through different worlds to help a crying girl whose moon has been shattered and stolen by a group of artists. The gameplay revolves around the typical Klonoa mechanics, grabbing enemies, tossing them, or using them for an upward boost. But this isn't just a simple platformer. The emphasis here is actually on puzzle solving. You'll need to collect 3 stars on each level to unlock the exit, and getting each of them can be tricky. I also just love the way this game looks. With it being a normal black and white WonderSwan game, it does do a lot to make it still look very Klonoa despite the limitations in the hardware, going as far to do stuff like parallax scrolling, something that the Game Boy could only dream about doing at the time. And on top of that, Klonoa Moonlight Museum does something unique that could only be done on the WonderSwan, and that's the ability to play the game vertically, with some stages designed to be played in this orientation. So if you're a Klonoa fan, this is a curiosity that is definitely worth seeking out. Moving on to a truly distinctive Dreamcast Zelda-style action RPG, Elemental Gimmick Gear, also known simply as Egg. This is the first game in the video that was actually released worldwide, but due to it being a Dreamcast exclusive that's hard to give a succinct pitch for, it seemingly was lost in the shuffle. Nevertheless, Egg is a special game that has a ton of neat ideas. You play as the Sleeper, who awakens after being asleep for a millennia, and in typical 90s RPG style, you have no memory of who you are. The world you awaken to has seemingly seemingly been ravaged by a cataclysm, and it's up to you and your egg-like suit of armor that you are found in, the titular elemental Gimmick gear, to figure out what the hell is going on. As for the presentation, imagine exploring a world made up of beautifully hand-drawn artwork in a top-down perspective, but when you face off against a boss, it transitions into a full-blown 3D battle. It's a striking way to give those encounters a real sense of scale and impact. Beyond that though, the typical gameplay has a unique flavor too. You'll be exploring ruins, solving puzzles that involve hitting switches and moving objects, you know, Zelda stuff, but when it comes to combat, there are a few odd tricks. Your primary attack is a quick punch, but you can also extend your arm for a longer reach or to grapple across gaps as you progress. You'll also get new abilities like fireballs and ice beams, but the most notable and arguably iconic thing about Egg is its spin attack. You can tuck your arms and legs in and spin to damage enemies and break through obstacles, basically turning you into a Beyblade. But you'll still need to be careful because doing this drains your health. Despite some shortcomings here and there, Elemental Gimmick Gear really is a truly unique Zelda-style game on the Dreamcast. It's one of those games that has this odd charm to it. So if you're looking for something a little bit different, definitely check out Egg. Master of Darkness was released for the Sega Master System in 1992, and it's clear to see that it was Sims and Sega's attempt to bring Castlevania to Sega consoles before Konami could do it officially later themselves with Castlevania Bloodlines. But Master of Darkness is one of those oddities that's fun to check out, regardless of how blatant it's just lifting everything from Castlevania. You play as Dr. Ferdinand Social, a parapsychologist in Victorian London, and Jack the Ripper is causing all sorts of trouble, but you suspect there's something more to what's going on beyond a few killings. And just like its inspiration, Dracula himself is behind everything. So now it's your job to take down the Master of Darkness. While the similarities here are undeniable, Master of Darkness brings its own vibe to the table too. Instead of just being locked to using a whip, you can find and use different primary weapons like a knife, a cane, or an axe, and each has its own range and power, so you'll need to choose wisely depending on the situation. There are also sub-weapons like a pistol, bombs, and a boomerang. If there's one common complaint about the early Castlevania series, it was just how rigid the movement was. But in Master of Darkness, the controls are much more responsive here, allowing for a lot more agile jumps. Visually, while it's still an 8-bit game, it looks fantastic for what it's doing. The environments are detailed and add atmosphere as you explore. If there's one major downgrade in comparison to Castlevania, it's the music. And it would be shocking, really, if it could compete in that department, but you know, while it is obviously a clone, Master of Darkness takes the core mechanics of Castlevania and does just enough to make it stand out in its own way. That said, if you're a fan of classic Castlevania, this is one that definitely deserves a look. Alright, moving on to a Dreamcast game that has a small but dedicated group of fans. Originally released in arcades as Gunspike, Canon Spike is what happens when you take a bunch of Capcom characters from their own major franchises and strap roller skates and hoverboards to their feet and hand them a gun. It's a top-down shooter where you get to choose from Mega Man, Cammy and Charlie from Street Fighter, Arthur out of Ghosts and Goblins, BB Hood from Darkstalkers, or even a few original characters to fight off waves of robots in an uprising. The story here isn't deep, but seeing these characters team up in this way is really the main attraction. The gameplay is about staying agile as you glide around and blast everything in sight. You get your standard kind of shots, a melee for close encounters, and special ranged moves for crowd control. Think of this as the Dreamcast era's take on something like Smash TV. And I think that this is a good entry point into the bullet hell genre due to its familiar faces and slightly forgiving difficulty compared to the other games in the genre. And if that sounds good to you, Canon Spike delivers exactly what it sets out to do. Because of its arcade structure, it's a short playthrough, but it's a really fun one to do multiple times with different characters, especially in co-op. So if you're after a unique bullet hell top-down shooter that throws in some fun Capcom cameos, give Canon Spike a look. Next up is Ghost Chaser Densei, a Super Famicom beat-em-up from 1994 that never left Japan. If you're into side-scrolling brawlers, you know that the SNES had plenty of them, like the Final Fight games or Turtles in Time. and this game here fits right in with those, but brings some of its own ideas as well. At first glance, it's the standard stuff. Walk to the right, punch dudes, fight a boss, you get your attack and your jump buttons, but where it shakes things up is its special move system. Instead of draining your health like a lot of other belt scrollers of this era, specials use a dedicated meter, and it's a meter that refills on its own when you stand still, or even a bit as you take a few hits. So it's the game's way of balancing things out if you're taking a beating. And since you're not exchanging your health for powerful attacks, it really encourages you to use your supers more often, which ends up leading to a lot more over-the-top chaos. But it's not just the specials, the basic combat also has a lot more going on here than a lot of other 16-bit brawlers. You can time blocks for counterattacks, and you can do air juggles for stringing hits together. There are 3 characters, each with unique moves, and there are even team-up attacks in co-op. So if you're like me, always looking for a quick beat-em-up to play through in an afternoon, give this one a look. Xexyz is an NES game that was released in 1990, and it's a pretty impressive mix of ideas for an NES game. It combines typical side-scrolling platforming stuff with horizontal shoot-'em-up stages. You play as Apollo in the year 2777, who's trying to save the nation of Xexyz from the mechanical Garuza. What makes Xexyz stand out is how it swaps gameplay. Every other stage is presented like a typical action platformer. You run, jump, shoot. It's not entirely dissimilar to games like Mega Man. But then on the other hand, the other set of stages switch things up, where you're put into a ship for Gradius-style side-scrolling shooting. I'd say that each section here isn't like the standout greatest in its genre, really, but being combined into one game really makes it more interesting. It's challenging as you might expect for a shmup, but with its unlimited continues, it makes things doable. If you're a fan of games on the NES that tried mixing genres, like Blaster Master or The Guardian Legend, Xexyz is worth seeking out.
See it now in 3D. Batteries not included.
The Virtual Boy is a much-hated console. Or is it a handheld? Regardless, it's justifiably shit on, in my opinion, or at least the hardware itself is. Because there are a few games that are decent enough or just odd enough to be worth checking out, especially now that you can play them in ways that are not staring directly into this terrible blood-red display. Innsmouth Manor is one of those oddities. It was released on October Friday the 13th, 1995, exclusively in Japan. And it's a first-person horror shooter drawing its name and fish-like creatures from H.P. Lovecraft's The Shadow over Innsmouth. The gameplay has you moving through the titular mansion's 45 floors in classic first-person dungeon crawler fashion. On each floor, you need to find a key and exit before the time runs out. One of the very few neat features of the Virtual Boy was its dual D-pads, which could act almost like an early version of a dual-stick control system. You use the left D-pad for movement and the right for aiming. Also, resources are scarce, making this in a way a true survival horror experience. Depending on your choice of route through the branching paths, it will lead you to one of 4 different endings. I assume with the required red and black stereoscopic 3D, it probably was a mess to look at. But booting this game up in other ways, you can adjust the palette so it's not so taxing on your eyes. And by doing so, you can finally appreciate the fun creature designs here and the sprite art that really was previously ruined by the dominant sanguine hues. This is one of the games that I wouldn't say is a great game, but I think Innsmouth Manor is an interesting piece of early first-person horror. In the Hunt is a side-scrolling shooter for the arcade, PS1, and Sega Saturn that often gets forgotten. Unlike most other side-scrolling shooters though, here you take control of a submarine. And yes, if you're wondering, this comes from the people who would later go on to spearhead the Metal Slug series. And like those, you're constantly facing chaotic battles. Here though, they're composed of battleships and mechanical sea creatures. Also, instead of many other games like this of its time, your control isn't locked into shifting up and down at a strict straight-on shootout. You have more control of your angles. You can even surface to shoot down airborne targets. And it being a submarine game at the time could have been what scared people off when it came out. I know that if you were to tell me about a submarine game without showing me any gameplay, I would just assume it would be like a tedious and boring kind of thing, where you're piloting a submarine. But here, it's nothing like that. Using the depth of the water to tactically avoid fire from the air feels really great, and it's really just generally super responsive. Like most games designed for the arcade, it can be a bit challenging, but nowadays you probably don't need to worry about dumping in a ton of credits to brute force your way through. If you're looking for a retro shooter that's not the usual spaceship setup, Check out In the Hunt. You can even find it on modern systems through the Arcade Archive series. Namco's Numan Athletics is an arcade sports game, but it's not the typical sports game. This one's about mutant athletes in some bizarre competitions. You pick one of 4 Numans to take on these inhuman feats, and the presentation here is very anime, with bright graphics and lots of color. It has 8 off-the-wall Olympic-style events, each set in a different country. One minute you're in Russia shooting down missiles, and the next you're trying to stop a bullet train in Japan. So if you're familiar with any Olympic-style games or like track and field, you'd be pretty familiar with this general structure. You need to beat the target score for each event to move on to the next. The controls stick to a simple 3-button setup, and the game shows you how to play before each round, which is nice for these minigame compilation sorts of games. I think what makes this worth checking out is its heightened reality. It pushes things past the dullness I find common in this genre. The goofy premise is entertaining, and with up to 4 players competing at once, it can become a great local multiplayer game. And the breakbeat soundtrack by Nobuyoshi Sano adds a lot of great energy here that he would be later known for from Ridge Racer and Tekken. Thankfully, Numan Athletics is another game that's available through the Arcade Archive series. So if you want a competitive arcade game that's full of strange moments, give Numan Athletics a shot. Next up is a PlayStation game with a cult fanbase, that being Trap Gunner. It's a mix of strategy and arcade action that's most similar to like the Bomberman formula, but it has a lot of unique things that set it apart also. It's the top-down action game, but instead of just blasting away, you're setting traps to catch your opponents. The main goal, like Bomberman, is to be the last person standing, and to achieve that, you use tons of different weapons, typical guns like shotguns and pistols, but also a whole arsenal of traps, mines, and pitfalls. The guns quickly lose focus, and the traps really become where the fun is. When you start a round, you choose from several different characters, and this is where it gets interesting because each has their own skills and, most importantly, their own set of traps. Staying alive means planning your trap placements carefully, and guiding enemies into well-placed traps is just really satisfying. But to keep things more clear, there's also a trap detection mode. By holding down a button, it lets you spot hidden enemy traps. But usually it's pretty hard to find the time to do so. But if you do, disarming one gets back some of your health, and that trap type is removed from your opponent's inventory for that round, which adds some strategy to when you use each trap, and if it's worth risking it being taken away from your toolset. Just like the last game, this is another one that's best in split screen. So give Trap Gunner a look if you want to try something new next time you get together with some friends.
Trap Gunner. Classic.
Wetrix is an N64 game that's really easy to falsely lump in with all of the other Tetris also-rans, but it isn't your standard block-dropping puzzle game. Picture a 3D isometric play area, and your job is to manage falling water by raising and lowering the topographic layout of the area. You build up walls to contain as much water as possible without filling the drain meter and ending the game. And you do that by using different uppers and downer shapes that are given to you in a really Tetris-style next queue of blocks. It's a really different spatial kind of challenge compared to the stacking that you get from Tetris. Besides the uppers to build and the downers to lower the ground, the water itself isn't static. It flows based on the shape of the terrain. It's a unique physics-based take on endless puzzle games. To spice things up and keep things less manageable, there are mines that blow holes in your dams, ice cubes that freeze water, and big land masses risk earthquakes, so you need to plan and be prepared. But you also have tools to assist you, like fireballs that evaporate waters and lakes, to score points and lower the drain meter. So if you want a puzzle game that breaks the mold, give Wetrix a look. The Firemen is a Super Nintendo game with a cult following that was developed by Human Entertainment, who's most well known for creating Clock Tower. But the Firemen is a very different kind of game. It puts you in a burning chemical factory as a fireman who needs to put out and navigate around a raging fire to save people from the blaze and stop the spread of dangerous chemicals. So the setup is a high-stakes rescue mission against the clock. It's a top-down game where you guide your firefighter through these burning rooms. And you fight the blaze with a fire hose that has 2 settings, a direct stream for distance and a wider spray for closer threats. But luckily the water here is unlimited, so you don't need to worry about running out. But you also get items like fire extinguishing bombs that really help you get out of trouble. But also you're not going in alone. An AI partner follows you and helps you out by using his axe and leading survivors out. But that might also make you think that this is playable in co-op, which it isn't, and honestly, I feel like that's a little bit of an oversight. But regardless, it's still a really impressive 16-bit game that has some really great fire tech under the hood. Each floor here ends with a confrontation against a boss of sorts. That makes things really interesting on top of the normal gameplay. If you're after a different kind of SNES action game with solid mechanics, track down the Firemen. And our final game is another Super Nintendo cult classic, this one called EVO Search for Eden. The premise here is wild and super high concept. You guide a creature through Earth's history, evolving it from a simple fish all the way to potentially becoming a human, with the goal of reaching the Garden of Eden. It mixes side-scrolling action platforming with character growth customization that's more commonly present in traditional style RPGs. The loop here involves swimming or walking through levels, fighting other creatures and eating them to earn evolution points, and you can spend them in the game's main draw, the evolution system, where you can upgrade your different parts like jaws, horns, body, tail, and changing these parts alter your stats, looks, and abilities. Like you might choose horns for ramming or improve your legs for better jumping. It's a lot like a proto version of Spore. And as you evolve through EVO's 5 different time periods, you need to keep adapting to stay competitive in the food chain. The story itself abstracts things a bit by having Gaia, the spirit of Earth, guiding you. And there are mysterious crystals that show up to mutate creatures into tough bosses that you have to take down. While the gameplay is a bit slow, especially at the start, with it basically just being a grind fest, EVO is still worth looking into because of just how different it is from any other Super Nintendo game. So if you want to follow the evolution of a creature across history, check this one out. Dark Arms on the Neo Geo Pocket Color is a really cool top-down adventure, RPG, action, shooter kind of thing, survival horror. It's a strange mix of different ideas, and that's a really cool thing to see on a console like the Neo Geo Pocket Color. You're going to be exploring this overworld while also blasting away all of these different gothic monsters. And while you do that, you're going to be collecting spirits and upgrading your weapons to progress through the game. So if you want to play a top-down Zelda-style game that has a good mix of Resident Evil in there, from a console that doesn't get a lot of love, don't forget about the Neo Geo Pocket Color and Dark Arms.
It's behind us. Shield recovered. More to the left.
Moving on to Bulk Slash, which is a game with an incredible effort out of the fan translation community, because there is a lot of work that went into this one. It's a Sega Saturn third-person mech game that is really impressive with so much character that went into this one. But boiled down, the gameplay here is a lot like Virtual On, or like my foothold in the genre, the Ghost in the Shell game on the PS1. But in this one, you're going to be transforming your mech into these different forms to take on different challenges. There's been a ton of awesome work done by an awesome community on making this game playable in English, including voice acting, and it's just really above and beyond.
Energy shots. Shield recovered.
Chaos Break is a PlayStation 1 game in the style of Resident Evil, but it takes pretty much a carbon copy of Resident Evil and then ups it into a little bit more of absurdity and a lot more action. You'll be playing as 2 different agents, one of them looking a lot like Jill Valentine, but you're going to be doing a lot more blasting here. And not unlike the later sections of the early Resident Evil games, you're going to be investigating this lab that's been overrun by mutant lab staff. So it's going to be pretty familiar to any Resident Evil fan out there. So if you're a fan of classic Resident Evil, sure, this isn't going to stack up to it really, but it's going to definitely have a lot of interesting different things in it that will definitely recall your nostalgia for those older games.
I know.
Whoa! What? Who are you?
Oh, Peter, don't you remember me? I'm Tink! Come on, let's go, hurry!
Hook for the Sega CD is a game that I can't really accurately represent in this video for copyright reasons, but the Sega CD version of Hook is super interesting because it actually uses the John Williams score from the movie. But if you've watched the movie Hook, you know what this is about. It's an older Peter Pan who's forced to go back to Neverland and save a bunch of kids, and he kind of forgot how that all worked. Though in the game here, he pretty quickly gets back into the role of Peter Pan and flying and jumping around, so most of that character development is just implied. In terms of gameplay, this is going to be a super straightforward platformer that has a little bit of combat in it. So if you want to play a game that is super nostalgic to even, the Robin Williams movie, but also retains the amazing classic score from John Williams, you should totally check this one out. It's a really neat little oddity. Next up is Scurge Hive, which is a GBA and Nintendo DS game that gives a lot of love to the Metroid franchise, but it does a few things in its own way to make it stand out. As you might expect, it's going to be a search action, find an object, unlock another door that you couldn't get through before sort of game, but unlike a lot of games in this genre, it's going to be done from an isometric perspective. So check that one out if you're looking for a Metroidvania that really does pay a lot of love and homage to specifically the Metroid series, while also doing things its own way. Undercover Cops is a Super Famicom and arcade beat-em-up, but really, just look at this game. The sprite art here is incredibly detailed for a Super Nintendo game. But yeah, besides that, this is going to be a pretty straightforward beat-em-up game, a belt-scroller action game. A lot of people have a lot of issues with genre names and stuff, It's Souls-likes or Metroidvanias, beat-em-ups even at this point, but you get what I mean here. This is going to be a lot like Final Fight, where you fight through a ton of different thugs to a boss on a side-scrolling sort of foreground-background movement Streets of Rage style thing. But as I said, the thing that makes this game really stand out amongst all of the tons of other beat-em-up games, which I'm going to be covering a lot more in this video, just to let you know, is it's just incredibly detailed sprite art, and it's really grimy, futuristic New York City setting, and I think that this is a really easy one to pick up and play through in like an hour on like a retro handheld, just a short time, quick session, get through it and put it down sort of game. PuLiRuLa is an arcade, Sega Saturn, and early PlayStation game that is a beat-em-up, but this one definitely has a lot of its own character to it. It's almost like what Parodius is to the shoot-em-up genre, PuLiRuLa is like that to the beat-em-up genre. It has this bizarre, cartoonish, almost Babes in Toyland anime art style to it, and that sort of approach to a game like this is pretty unique. So if you're a fan of beat-em-ups like myself, but want to play something with a lot of unique character to it, there's that one to check out. Dr. Slump on the PlayStation 1 is an adaptation of the manga from Toriyama that predated Dragon Ball. In this game, you're going to be exploring and doing a lot of different mini-games and talking to a village full of charming characters. It's sort of like a loose take on Ocarina of Time, but done with less of a combat focus and more of a childlike sense of whimsy to it. So if you're a fan of the Dr. Slump series, or just like the village sections in a lot of RPGs, or even like Hyrule Castletown, give this translation done by Hilltop Works a good look. Avenging Spirit is a Game Boy game that has a really awesome core hook to it, and that is that you play as a little ghost and you can possess enemies and use their abilities to take out all the other enemies. Your goal here as the ghost is to get revenge and save your kidnapped girlfriend. So if you're looking for a typical straightforward action platformer, but you also want to have a fun little twist, make sure you give that one a look. Shadow Force is an arcade beat-em-up, but just like the last game, this game also has a possession mechanic where you can play as the enemies, and I always think that that's a fun little gimmick. This one got caught up in the ninja craze of the 90s, and it really shows. So if you're a fan of this genre, I think that this is another beat-em-up that's worth adding to your list. Rampage Puzzle Attack is a GBA game that I was not expecting to get addicted to on my Ambernick handheld, but when you boot this game up, it just has fundamental fun gameplay to it. What this game really is a port of Drop Mania, but with a Rampage-themed coat of paint on it, and I just really find that gameplay pretty fun. It plays similarly to something like Super Puzzle Fighter 2 Turbo, but instead of being able to rotate your pieces all the way around, you just can kind of swap them horizontally. So you're going to be connecting these big sections of colored blocks together, and then dropping like a detonation cube on top of them to get rid of all of that color on the screen. It's pretty much as simple as it can get, and for a game that you're just going to sit out and veg with, especially if you have a retro handheld, this is a really good one just to get absorbed into if you're looking to unwind. Marvelous Another Treasure Island is a SNES pretty well-known game at this point. I know I'm kind of stretching hidden gems with this one, but it's a game that really takes a lot from The Legend of Zelda: A Link to the Past and makes it into less of an action-y game and more of just a pure puzzle adventure logic game. The most notable fact about this one is something that you've probably already heard already, but it was directed by Eiji Aonuma, who went on to basically become the godfather of the Zelda series. In this one, you're going to be switching between 3 different kids that have their own abilities to explore this island and see what hidden treasure they can find. So if you're a Zelda fan and the combat just kind of gets in the way, this one's great if you're just looking for a straightforward puzzle-solving little adventure.
Sword. Grenade. Sword.
The Outfoxies is an arcade game that I think should get a lot more credit for basically creating the platform fighting genre. And I think that it doesn't because a lot of people in the West haven't played it because this was a Japan-only arcade game. The gameplay here is, a lot like Smash Brothers. You're going to be fighting on these large arenas and using weapons and stage hazards to win. But in this case, it does a lot more of the weapons and stage hazard stuff and a lot less of the melee combat, though it still is here in some ways. The plot to this one is that you play as a bunch of different assassins that fight for this mysterious Mr. Acme. So if you and a buddy want to play a game that's pretty much the granddaddy of Super Smash Brothers, make sure you don't let that one slip you by. The Nightmare Before Christmas, The Pumpkin King is a licensed game on the Game Boy Advance, and this isn't going to be the only one in this video, but I think around this time a lot of people just assumed a lot of the licensed games on the Game Boy Advance were just shovelware trash, but there was a lot of interesting stuff that was happening on that platform at the time that I just think got brushed under the rug a little bit too quick. In this case, it's a prequel to The Nightmare Before Christmas, and you play as Jack Skellington, but it's a Metroidvania, and I think that that alone makes this a pretty neat oddity and worth at least booting up and checking out a little bit. Sure, it's not going to stack up to like Aria of Sorrow, but it is a Nightmare Before Christmas Metroidvania game. How odd is that? So make sure you give that one a look if you're a frequent visitor to Hot Topic. Cliffhanger Edgar Randy is an arcade action game where you're basically Indiana Jones. You're going to be using your whip to attack and swing through levels and defeat enemies. It has this really cinematic presentation to it that sells the Indiana Jones thing. So if you're a big fan of indie and want to see some arcade hardware pushed to its limits, this is a really neat little adventure. Ihatovo Monogatari is a really neat little proto-cozy type game. It's inspired by the stories of Kenji Miyazawa, and it's just a nice little peaceful adventure. You're gonna be exploring, collecting items, and talking to tons of different characters, and it has just nice laid-back vibes. So if you're looking for a calm slice of life, make sure you give that one a look. Star Wars Episode 3 Revenge of the Sith on the GBA is a game that, I know, probably really stretching the underrated tag here on this one, but it was doing something that a lot of games of its era weren't doing anymore, and that was being a licensed game that is a beat-em-up. And what I mean by that is that, like a decade before this, is when the beat-em-up genre kind of fizzled out, especially for licensed games, and only recently it's kind of been reinvigorated with stuff like Shredder's Revenge, and even those like Power Rangers one that just came out, and there's a G.I. Joe one, so it's become a new revival of sorts lately. But this one came out right in the dark era, where it was less common to see an adaptation like this. Really, if I'm comparing this to any beat-em-ups, it's more similar to something like River City Ransom or the Scott Pilgrim game, because it's going to have a lot more length to it than a lot of other beat-em-ups, and it has a whole upgrade system to it. And I also just really like its art style. It has a lot of really great kind of almost chibi takes on Star Wars characters, and that just makes the aesthetic really charming. So if you're a Star Wars fan and you only are familiar with really the PlayStation 2 3D action game that came out around Revenge of the Sith, make sure you at least boot that one up. Kusou Kogaku Seku Gulliver Boy is a Super Nintendo action-adventure game that might be a big hit for fans of games like Secret of Mana. And like that game, you're going to be exploring, talking to NPCs, and fighting enemies, but I think the thing that makes this one really stand out is its amazing pixel art and character portraits. I mean, look at this. It's like Yu-Gi-Oh! It looks incredible on the SNES. So if you're looking for a new action RPG, make sure you give that one a look. Robo Army on the Neo Geo is just another super solid beat-em-up, and in this one you're going to be playing as a cyborg who has this transformation mechanic, and you're going up against this professor's titular Robo Army. So chuck that one on the pile of other solid beat-em-ups that you can probably beat in one sitting. King of Demons is a super strange, kind of jank take on Castlevania, but in this one you're going to be blasting away to rescue your family from hell. Another common mechanic that keeps coming up in this video is transformation, and in this one you can transform into different demons to take out the opposition. So if you're looking for a classic Castlevania style game, but you want it to be not quite as good and a lot more weird, you've got to give that one a chance. If that last game wasn't enough Castlevania for you, here I have Hunter x Hunter Kinden no Haidu on the Game Boy Color, which is a Castlevania-style game, and it was even made by Konami. So it's going to deliver on the Castlevania that you expect, but this just happens to have the Hunter x Hunter license to it. And as somebody who's not really familiar with Hunter x Hunter, this one is just a really neat game for Castlevania fans too. So if you want to play an action platform game with some light RPG progression to it, and are maybe even a fan of Hunter x Hunter, make sure you give that one a look. Battle Circuit is yet another beat-em-up game because, you know, I like the genre, this is my video after all, but Battle Circuit is one from Capcom, and I really love this one a lot. And this is one that is probably a little bit more well-known, especially because it was released as part of the Capcom beat-em-up bundle, but I still think this one doesn't get the recognition that it deserves. What it basically does is takes Capcom's other major beat-em-up franchise, that being Final Fight, and ups the ante into the absurdity of new level, or maybe even like takes Captain Commando and mixes it in there, and it just makes it a total totally bombastic, over-the-top, awesome beat-em-up with a ton of character to it. The plot to this one is that you play as a bunch of different bounty hunters who are capturing criminals all over the galaxy, and you also take down a dangerous computer program. So if you're a big fan of Capcom's beat-em-up output around this time, you definitely have to give this one a shot. I think this one is one of their best. TMNT Radical Rescue on the Game Boy is a game that really was punching above its weight for a licensed game at its time, because this one is basically a Metroidvania game where you go around and save the different turtles who all have their unique abilities that you can use to take out different obstacles around the map. You can even check this one out as part of the new Turtles collection that's out, and I really think that this is honestly one of the best games in there besides like Turtles in Time. So if the idea of a Ninja Turtles Metroidvania game really sparks some interest in you, give this one a good look. Moving on to yet another beat-em-up, it's not gonna stop. I'm a big fan of the genre, and I think that a lot of these just got swept under the rug because they weren't X-Men or Ninja Turtles, you know? But this one is also from Konami, just like those games, and I think this one stands up to those and is a great game in its own right. The hook to this one is that it's another transformation kind of game, yet another recurring theme here. And what it does is it pretty much delivers on Altered Beast, and does it way better than Altered Beast ever really did. Melfan's Story is a Super Nintendo action side-scrolling game that I think has a lot of character to it. You're going to be hacking and slashing and collecting items and choosing different paths to take on a map. You have 4 different heroes to usurp the king and take out the different allies, and what you're going to be doing is basically going through their own little unique stories. This is one I think is more of an oddity than a great game, but I think this one's definitely worth booting up if you see it in your ROM collection.
Ash, Gren, Bold.
Dungeon Magic is another beat-em-up from the arcade, but this one happens to take place from a more isometric perspective. You'll be fighting, collecting items, and basically playing a D&D game that's not officially D&D. Each character has their own stats that makes each of them feel pretty different, and there are branching paths, so there's a lot of different ways that things can go. So check that one out if you've already played through the official Capcom D&D games, and you want a slightly different take. The Shaman King Master of Spirits games are kind of like a spiritual successor-ish of that Hunter x Hunter game that I talked about a little bit earlier. What they're basically going to deliver is another Castlevania-style experience, but this time it's going to be more in the vein of Aria of Sorrow, because you're going to be taking different enemies' spirits and using them in a similar way that you do in that game. Shaman King is another manga and anime franchise that I'm not really familiar with, but this one just delivers a super cool game that might satisfy an itch if you're a big fan of Aria of Sorrow. But obviously this doesn't deliver as great of an experience as that game, but, you know, it scratches the itch a little bit. Moving on to the final beat-em-up in this video, I promise you, is Gaia Crusaders, and it is just another solid one of these. This one being set in a post-apocalyptic setting, and you have a bunch of different characters with a bunch of different abilities, and there's a whole magic system, and, you know, it does the beat-em-up stuff, and it does it pretty well. So that one's another one for the pile. Far East from Eden Zero is a Super Famicom Japanese exclusive game that had a ton of love and work put into it, kind of like Bulk Slash, where it took a lot of work from a fan community to really make this one work in English, because there's just so much text in this one. And that goes a long way to flesh out this world and really make each of the NPCs into their own characters. Another reason why this game probably wasn't localized officially at the time of its release is because it used a lot of hardware on the actual cartridge that a lot of other games didn't. This game made use of like a real-time clock and a ton of different tech that really wasn't present in a lot of Super Nintendo games. So if you're a fan of turn-based RPGs, especially games like Dragon Quest, I think you definitely need to give this one a look. There was just so much love and passion and work that went into this one from a community of people who just wanted to make this finally available in English, and it really paid off. Then we have the final game in this video, and it is Car Battler Joe. It is a really unique game on the Game Boy Advance. And that's because it's like a vehicular combat RPG. So what you're going to be doing is fighting other enemies in these car-based battles, earning money to upgrade your car even more to take on even more challenging enemies. It really stands out amongst the other games in the GBA library. If you bumped into me on the street and asked for a Super Famicom recommendation, I'd probably say Tetris Battle Gaiden, but then I would say Gunpole Gunman's Proof, because it's a really awesome game. At first glance, I'm sure your mind goes straight to A Link to the Past, and that's pretty much what you're getting here, but with a bunch of the variables swapped out. Instead of the fantasy setting, you're going to be in a Wild West world that has been invaded by aliens. And instead of hacking and slashing your way to save the day, you're going to be shooting and crawling under gunfire through dungeons. It's a really clever and charming fun take on the Zelda formula that often feels like Mother 3, Shin-Chan, and A Link to the Past all got into a blender. You play as a kid who is possessed by an alien space sheriff who's on the hunt on Earth for these other alien convicts who have escaped here and also taken on their own earthly forms. The structure here is basically built around this central hub town where you branch off and go collect bounties, come back and collect your rewards. And also in this town you can gain access to items and new abilities like new guns, like a rocket launcher or shotgun, by talking to the town's gunsmith. But when you're out collecting a bounty, one of my favorite things about the gun system is when the gun power-up drops from an enemy, it stays there on the ground rotating through all of the different guns that you've learned, and you can pick what kind of gun you want to really specialize in. This is one of those games that was made at the end of the Super Famicom's life cycle, so that's probably why it was never officially translated, because they were already moved on to the N64 during that time. But if a slapstick, sci-fi, western Zelda game sounds good to you, I really hope you find a way to play this one. Alright, so Game Freak, you know, the Pokemon people. Everybody knows that. But what fewer people know about is their non-Pokemon games that they made. But the one I want to talk about here is Warriors, the Blue Dragon Legend, The Two Heroes. It's another Japan-only Super Famicom game that they made right after making the original Pokemon games and before those even made it over here to the West. So it was made in this strange period for them where the worldwide obsession over Pokemon didn't happen yet, but they were still cranking out new games. Warriors of the Blue Dragon Legend is a very interesting game that has a lot of the elements that you might recognize from Pokemon from around this time, especially the really amazing artwork by Ken Sugimori. Due to the timing of this one, I get a ton of Gen 2 vibes off of the art in this game. But beyond the superficial similarities to the Pokemon series, you play as a young boy who's destined to become a great hero like his father. His village is at war with and is being overtaken by monsters, and you need to save your sister who has been taken by a giant one that looks suspiciously like Ho-Oh. The gameplay here is split into 3 different ways. There's the overworld exploration sections that are similar to like Zelda or even Pokemon. Then there are the visual novel-y kind of sections where you're talking to NPCs, and when you enter buildings, you can kind of look around a little bit and find items. And then finally, there's the combat system, which when you first take a look at it, it is this side view battle screen, but it looks like a real-time like platformer or something, but it's actually not. It's a turn-based side-scrolling kind of combat system, which is pretty unique. Basically everything here happens on a grid, like when you move, the enemies move, and when you attack, the enemies attack, that sort of thing. It becomes about spacing and blocking appropriately to get through each of the combat encounters. The reasons why this one probably wasn't released outside of Japan is because there's a lot of like Japanese cultural stuff that I think they just thought wouldn't translate to a Western audience. And also, Pokemon really wasn't a huge massive hit, so it wasn't a foregone conclusion that a Game Freak game was going to be translated and ported over here. So if you're a fan of Gen 2 era Ken Sugimori artwork like me, I think this one is just worth booting up just for that alone. Monster Maulers is a really unique arcade game that blends fighting and beat-em-up elements in a pretty unexpected way. Instead of facing off against like the typical human-style fighters, you're gonna be battling these colossal monsters in this boss rush mode. That said, it still plays a lot like a fighting game. It just puts those mechanics into a new sort of context. Most of the game is in this boss-only sort of gameplay, but later on there are these occasional side-scrolling sections that really feel more like a traditional beat-em-up, but they're really easy and they might just be here to kind of pad things out a bit. It really doesn't add much to the game, but if this game interests you, you can even boot it up with a friend and take on all of the bosses co-op. It only takes about half an hour to get through this one, but it's pretty unique and fun, so it's worth coming back to every now and then to see if you can kind of master your character's main moves. Violinist of Hamelin is a puzzle platformer on the Super Famicom where you play as a violinist and you guide around his assistant Flute. You have to use Flute to solve different puzzles and get around different obstacles by doing stuff like using her as a stepladder or turning her into an ostrich so she can cross spikes. You know, logical puzzle solving stuff. That said, when you turn her into different animals, that's not really turning her into another animal, she's just getting into a costume, but those costumes give her different abilities to do stuff like crossing spikes or jumping really high in a frog suit. The graphics here are what is really charming and funny about this one because it's based off a comedy manga by the same name, and it's all about how this violinist hero takes advantage of this girl's goodwill to have her do a lot of dirty work in their adventures. So boiled down, this game is kind of an escort mission, but honestly, it's not as frustrating as that might seem. But yeah, this is a really fun and charming game, and I think if you like the quirky kind of vibe of this game, you should definitely check this one out if you're looking for another great 16-bit puzzle platformer. Speaking of puzzle platformers, Samurai Kid on the Game Boy Color is not exactly what I was expecting. I was expecting a game called Samurai Kid to be an action game, but this is more of a puzzle platformer. Instead of primarily using your sword like you might expect a samurai, you use the gourd that you carry around a lot to turn your enemies into blocks that allow you to solve puzzles and hold down buttons. You can also charge up your moves to do stuff like slash through crates or make a tornado with your fan. But yeah, this is like all about using the tools that you have to solve the puzzles that are in front of you. The graphics here are really sharp and colorful, even for a Game Boy Color game. I just really like how well defined these characters are. I know that was more of a necessity on the Game Boy Color itself, but I think this game up-res on a newer display looks really sharp still. This is another one of the games that never officially came out in English, but there is a fan translation out there for you. So if you're looking for a puzzle game with some unique samurai trappings to it, this one's worth checking out. Alright, time for yet another Zelda-style game, and it's not even the last one in this video. I don't know, I guess I was on that Zelda kick for real. But this time, it is Willow on the NES. This is based on the movie, you know, of the same name from Lucasfilm with Warwick Davis and everything, but it really doesn't follow the plot too closely. Just imagine this is a story that happens in that world and isn't necessarily a direct adaptation of the story you see in the movie. When you first set your eyes on this one, it is pretty clear that it is aping Zelda's style quite a bit, but it's not really that level of quality, to be honest. There's a ton of confusing mazes, so I really recommend looking up online maps or something if you're going to play this one. But that said, it's still a pretty solid oddity that if you're into leveling up, collecting items, learning magic spells, you know, all the action RPG kind of stuff from this era, this is a pretty good choice for you. I'd say the graphics here are really amazing for the NES, because there's all sorts of detail to them that, even though it's an 8-bit game, it looks like it's slowly edging closely to a 16-bit graphical style. The music here is also really incredible, and I really like the songs kind of on their own, but in-game it can get overshadowed by the fact that the tracks restart really often, because if you leave a zone, imagine if you leave a battle zone and then go into the overworld theme, you do that quite a bit in this game, and the restarting of the tracks can get pretty irritating. But with all that said, it's not the greatest game, but, you know, if this looks interesting to you, you might as well boot it up if you can. Dragon's Revenge is a pinball game on the Genesis that is a follow-up to a port of Devil's Crush to the Genesis that itself was called Dragon's Fury, so yeah, this is a kind of weird, estranged cousin to the Crush pinball series. The thing that I like to see in video pinball games is things happening on the tables that can't really happen in real-life pinball. That's probably because the game that got me into video pinball games was Pokemon Pinball, and that's filled with that sort of stuff, and there's really no arguing that that's still a top-tier entry in this genre. But set your expectations a lot lower for this, because this isn't anything close to as good as Pokemon Pinball. It's a fantasy-themed table with dragons and damsels in distress. It's a very 80s dark fantasy take, you know, like airbrush van art vibes. And sometimes that kind of schlock is really fun to indulge in. The physics with the ball here are even a bit wonky, but I still think it's pretty fun. I'd say that everything top to bottom here is like direct-to-video, fantasy, best of the worst tier quality, you know? But that said, I think that's still a fun sort of thing to check out every once in a while. But if you're like me and just like when ball hit flipper make noise, I clap like Seal. So if you're looking for a mindless sort of game to occupy yourself, this is really totally a fine, fun, dumb, stupid game to play in a half-lucid state. Kokorone is another super janky game, but it's another game that has a really weird hook to it, and that is that it's really heavy on character customization, which was really unique for the NES. Before you start your game, you create your hero that you want by choosing a head, a body, and a weapon, each coming with their own different attributes that affect how your game is gonna feel to play. Basically, how much damage you deal out, how much health you have, and how your character feels to jump. As for gameplay, it's very bare bones Mega Man, probably because it was directed by Akira Kitamura, who was the planner on the first Mega Man. With all that said though, it's really bare bones, like very sparse, and all the enemy placement feels like it was very haphazard, and the levels are kind of crap, to be honest. And then you get to the bosses, and the bosses are, you know, like Mega Man style bosses, where you have to dodge a lot of projectiles, but all of their attack patterns are equally as haphazard as the enemy placement, so it's just a honestly kind of terrible game. But I think that the character customization is really fun to fool around with here, and I think that's more than enough to keep people interested for 15 minutes or so while they boot this up and check it out. So if you don't mind scraping the absolute bottom of the barrel to just see some neat kind of ideas from this era, you know, you could do this game. Play this, I guess. I don't know. Hunter, Roddy and Cathy is a Neo Geo game that brings Metal Slug to mind, but it's really just kind of a weird beat 'em up with characters that have stretchy arms like Ristar or Luffy from One Piece. Beyond the arm stuff, the main gimmick here is the plane switching, where you can jump between the foreground and background, which in theory makes it a strategical kind of thing where you can hop between planes to avoid enemy attacks and stuff, but I was just terrible at that. It was often pretty hard to gauge really what was on which plane, especially during different boss fights, so I was really bad at it, but I could see that if you played this game often enough, you'd get more familiar with it. Anyway, think like grabbing and tossing enemies like Ristar, and it's a pretty chill game that you can play co-op with a buddy. This is also a game that has gotten a hamster re-release, so you can even pick this game up on modern consoles. The Frog for Whom the Bell Tolls is a Japan-only game on the Game Boy, and if you're a big fan of Zelda, you might have already heard of this one. It's known for being basically the source of the engine that eventually powered Link's Awakening. While there are some clear Zelda vibes with this one, it really stands out in a few key ways. For starters, it's much more focused on storytelling than the early Zelda games, and the combat here is automatic. Like when you bump into another enemy and engage into a fight, the stronger man comes out on top. Aside from that stuff though, you'll still be exploring and collecting items to progress, similar to a Zelda game, but with a little bit of another tweak here. In this game, power-ups like extra health and attack boosts aren't really just bonuses like they might be in a Zelda game. They're like necessary for the game progression. For example, if you're short on a heart or two, you like literally can't get past certain enemies that are blocking your progress. So it's like your health and your power are being used as the gating mechanism that like a Zelda item like a hookshot or something might be used in a Zelda game. But beyond all that stuff, it's just a fully charming game. It's full of quirky characters and really funny dialogue. I'd say the fan translation that I've been playing really nails the funniness of this game. It's just a real lighthearted good time. The story revolves around two different rival princes who get turned into frogs and need to work together to undo that and defeat the big bad at the end. You might even recognize some of the characters from this game, like Prince Richard, who appears in Link's Awakening, or Prince Sable, who pops up as an assist trophy in Smash Bros. So since Nintendo has never officially translated this game, and if you're a fan of Nintendo, I really highly recommend checking this one out. The fan translation is more than competent enough. This is a really great game to check out. The Jetsons' Invasion of the Planet Pirates is a really good SNES game, even though it might not be expected because it's a licensed game. It's a 2D side-scroller where you play as George Jetson, and you use a vacuum to suck up items and enemies, kinda like in a Kirby kinda way, but the cool part is that you can also suck to the walls and to the ceilings. The graphics are super colorful, and it really is just a really good looking game. But the real wow factor here is just how well it nails the mechanics and game feel. It was so good that they even took this game and IP scrubbed it, and then put a different IP from Japan on it and released it there, because this game really was just that good of a foundation. I think you should check this one out even if you don't really have any care for the Jetsons brand. It's just a really great unsung solid platformer out there. Crusader of Senti is probably the most well-known game in this video, but I still think it doesn't really get the love that it needs. It's another Zelda-style adventure game, but you end up recruiting animals that help you out and give you new abilities. And that's because you play as a character who loses his ability to speak to humans, but gains that ability with animals. Visually, it looks really nice. It being a late-era Genesis game, it makes it feel, like the developers really figured out how to use this platform to its fullest. The music is also really great, but with all that said, it came out in 1994, which was kind of the tail end of the 16-bit generation, so it just became a sort of unknown. But with that said, you can actually play this game on the Nintendo Switch, because it's part of the Nintendo Online online expansion pass, like the Genesis section there. But I think this game is a really, really awesome game, so make sure you check this one out. There's even a secret cameo from Sonic. The Sonic lounging on the beach chair image, that's from this game. So if you're into classic top-down Zelda, I think you definitely should boot up Crusader of Senti. And that's a wrap on this video. I covered over 75 really cool retro games, and I hope you found something here that you might add to a list or check out. Now, I know I missed a ton, but it's impossible not to. So what's your #1 obscure retro game that I didn't cover here and you think I should cover here in the future? I'm genuinely curious because a lot of the games that I covered in this video came from recommendations of other viewers in the past. So leave your recommendation down in the comments. But really, thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate you hanging out for this Goliath of a video. And if you enjoyed it, you know what to do. Do all the YouTube-y stuff, like, subscribe, do all that stuff. It really does help out a ton. And if you really, really like what I did here, you can head over to patreon.com/CABrown and support the channel directly. Okay, and that's all for now. See you in the next one.